Today's meeting is called, I'm going to read it out properly, The Revival of Resistance, the 2022-23 Strikes and the Battle Still to Win. Both of our speakers today, Mark Thomas and Jess Walsh, National Workplace and Trade Union organisers for Socialist Workers' Party and part of the Socialist Workers' Party elected leadership. They're very brilliant. They're authors of this book that kind of is characterising the meeting and will be available after, along with Charlie Kinder. So you can find out more about what they think in this. So we're going to move quite quickly to get started with our meeting. Our first speaker will be Mark Thomas. I'll give you a shout when you're ready to sum up. But please enjoy the meeting and we will return to the discussion in a few minutes.
Okay. Well, why did Jess, myself, and Charlie Kimber, the editor of Socialist Worker, produce this small book that we're talking about today and introducing? And there's really two reasons. The first is that to recognise, as I think we all do, that something significant has changed in the working class in the last year. Working class people have started to fight back on a scale we haven't seen for a generation. Just to give you one measure of that, last year when we met at Marxism, I think we had the first round of rail strikes, and it was a moment of expectation and so on. And what's happened over the last year, between June and April, so that's 11 months, where we have the figures from the government about the number of strike days, they add up to 3.743 million strike days. I think when May's figures come in a couple of weeks, it will probably hit 4 million. Now, there are days in British working class history, years, with considerably more action than that. But we haven't seen those for 32 years. In the last 32 years, since 1990, not a single year had 2 million strike days. In fact, not that many had 1 million. Something big and significant is changing here that we have to recognise. But there's a second reason. And the second reason is that this movement, I want to argue, is not free of problems. It's not true that everything is just rosy in the garden. And we have to do more than cheerlead. And I think we have to do something that doesn't happen on much of the wider trade union movement or the left, which is we have to attempt to draw a balance sheet of that experiences, the strengths and the weaknesses, and to think about what are the barriers that we need to overcome if we want to develop the full potential of this movement, and crucially, to see some real breakthroughs and big victories on a national scale, which we still essentially, I think, have an absence of. Now, the strikes that we've seen have involved a series of high-profile national disputes, visible in the national media: British Telecom, rail strikes, post, civil service, schools, universities, hospitals. I don't think I've missed anything, but very, very impressive. Secondly, less visible, but very important, a raft of what you might call more local strikes, often bus workers, refuse workers, dockers, airports, and so on, often involving Unite and the GMB. And one of the things that's important here, often those that involve much more substantial layers of action, including indefinite action, and sometimes on some quite big victories. I also just want to note, and especially this was true last summer, that we've also seen some episodes, I don't want to overstate it, but still we have to pay careful attention to all of the strikes I mentioned are official strikes, called by the national unions inside the framework of the anti-union laws that are so constrictive and so on. But we've had some moments of unofficial action. The action on the North Sea oil rigs. Careful not to say you walk out. You don't walk out of them. You sit here. You might do that. Very, very interesting. The magnificent walkouts we've heard a bit about at Marxism without union organisation, essentially, at Amazon plants, are now translating into a unionisation drive at Coventry, and with a potential for a whole new sector There are some challenges involved, actually. The potential to unionise a whole new sector, something we haven't seen in the working class for a long time. We've even seen some moments of secondary sympathy strikes. There was a fascinating moment during the Liverpool dockers strike when the employers they tried to reroute the ships away from strike-bound Liverpool to some other docks. And we don't know everything that happened here, but we do know that at Southampton the dockers refused to handle that. Outside the union laws, interestingly, again, to my knowledge, the union wasn't taken to court. Why not? I suspected they were terrified that if they went to unite, the strikes would spread to the other docks. It's a very important lesson for us here. So, now, in the book, and the opening chapters about the strike movement, I think we've gone through 3 or 4 phases in most of the disputes. But the first phase, and that's been true every time a new group of workers has entered the battle, I think it's been marked by a sense of tremendous enthusiasm and often very sizable picket lines. There's been no national all grades rail strike since '93, no BT national strike since '87. The Royal College of Nursing haven't taken strike action in England and Wales in its 106 years of its existence. There hasn't been a dockers strike in Liverpool since '99, or in Felixstowe since 1989. That means workers entering these battles haven't had previous experience, by and large, of entering. Incredible enthusiasm. And even in unions, I don't know, think of the PCS in the civil service or the NEU, there have been more recent experiences. There are so many young new workers in those who've never taken strike action. It's almost a festival feeling on those picket lines. And surges in union membership. I mean, I know the NEU, someone will probably correct me, I think since they announced their ballot result, they've had 60,000 net gain in their membership. The PCS union is growing again, pushing back to 200,000. So we've seen how the strikes drive the growth of trade unions. Yeah, and Mick Lynch, the rail workers leader, when he said the working class is back and it refuses to be poor, it caught that feeling that was there inside the working class movement. But if that was the beginning of almost every strike, the second phase is the way the strikes very quickly became marked by the establishment of, in the national strikes, a pattern of episodic strike days. 1 or 2 days a month is the typical pattern. This kind of intermittent action, usually with the argument put by the union leaderships, but sometimes quite widely accepted initially, that that's really the maximum. Especially the big national disputes are with strike pay, very rarely strike pay and so on. This is the maximum we can achieve. But inevitably, this limits the pressure on an employer or the government to cough up because they can hope to ride it out. And this is then reinforced by the willingness of the leaderships to cancel, postpone, delay strikes. Usually for 2 reasons. One, a fear of public opinion. We can't strike when the Queen's died. We can't strike on Poppy Day. The argument that was had in the National Education Union about not striking during the exam period, effectively imposing an 8-week pause, wasn't really about the practicalities of the exams. It was about a nervousness about the attacks from the Daily Mail. The second reason, not completely unrelated, is the offer of talks. Not the promise of a deal, offer of talks. And again, I think that pressure to think we must appear reasonable in the eyes of public opinion, only media opinion, not necessarily what the mass of ordinary people, but be reasonable. And thank God the union official is back around the table talking to management, as if that's the central aim. And this reflects the fact that the driving force predominantly of the disputes has been from above. Has been from the national trade union leadership and the trade union bureaucracy, which Jess will talk more about. And therefore, we should also note that this pattern, this stop-start pattern, has been a feature, sure, of what do you want to call the more moderate unions, the right-wing unions, the Pat Cullen and the RCN, Christine McAnear and the ambulances and Unison, but actually not that different when you look to Dave Ward and the CWU, or Mark Sawakra and the PCS, or Mick Lynch in the RMT. The third phase, though, because you can have talks, but unless you get a deal, there's a lot of pressure on the unions to keep going back to strike, hence the stop and then the start again. But at some point in each dispute, on the whole, and I think for the government, in some ways beginning after the health strike began, there was a shift. A couple more percent, 5% typically in much of the public sector. One-off payments, you get it next year, but not for the next 30 years you're working, and it's not in your pension. 2-year deals. The CW's been offered a 3-year deal, just 10%. Right? Some gains, some increases to be sure, but still often much lower than inflation. And that reflects, if you like, that a limited strategy at best delivers limited results. Some better, like the EIS, the Scottish teachers, some, like I say, I think really miserable with a terrible offer in the CWU. Union leaders, and there's a phrase you hear when they say, and it makes me nervous, they say, it's not just about pay. Now, there's a very good side to that, which is it's not just about pay, it's about work to do, it's about the services, it's about the way people were treated in the pandemic, it's about the erosion of services on breaking point after a decade or so. It isn't just about pay. But I think too often when the union leaders say it's not just about, what they mean is we're not really going to fight for above inflation pay deal. Now, the question is there and has there been an alternative to this? Now, from the beginning, Socialist Worker has been arguing for escalation. And I just want to unpack that, because I think there's two levels to it. The first is the question of more coordination. I mean, my God, every picket point you go to, sometimes before you've even got Socialist Worker, someone would say to you, we should all be out together. We need a general strike. Remember all that? Is it popular? You know, there's not many rooms of strikers and supporters where you say we should all be out together. We don't get a big round of applause. But the gap between the popularity and some of the rhetoric and the actual reality, we have had some moments. I think the 1st of February, 15th of March, about 500,000 workers across a number of unions. But even then, there were unions without live strike mandates that didn't act. So the question is, why shouldn't we get more coordination? How do we push for more of it? But there's a deeper level, that's the easier argument, should be made. There's a harder argument, which is that we need strikes to last longer, have fewer gaps, to hit harder, up to and including indefinite action. And here, one of the lessons of some of the local strikes, I mean, there's a number of examples. National Express workers in the West Midlands, about 3,000 of them, had an indefinite strike, which I think lasted about 3 days before the employer crumbled and won 16%. Well, you know, that's something more like it. Again, I get very nervous about a phrase that you hear from too many unions. It's a long haul. It's a long haul. And there's a danger of protracted disputes, people start to lose faith they're going to really deliver, and suddenly start to get wobbles. And then actually, we don't want a long haul, we want to hit hard and fast. Now, this is a hard one, I'm sorry. It's not true that everybody will just agree with you, especially in the early phases. But you have to put these arguments. I mean, inside the UCU, where especially the old universities have rounds and rounds of strikes, people have learned the hard way. And they were able to win a vote for indefinite action, which under the union leadership, Joe Brady, the General Secretary, sought to undermine and retreat on. At the NEU conference, when he said, comrades got up, at least one of them in this room, and said, we shouldn't pause, this will weaken our strike. Not everybody agreed. People listened, but maybe 15-20% voted that it's good. You have to put that part of that argument, because people are going through a process of learning these things. The final kind of couple of points I want to make is, I think the element of contestation, of questioning the strategy, feeling that something's not quite right with the strategy, it's not everywhere, but it's grown. And the flashpoints it's come out, the sharpest have been over poor deals. Again, not in every union and so on, but what happened, for example, with the Royal College of Nursing, campaigned excellently for 19%, then I think it was a 5% deal and they want to recommend it. And the key point is, people didn't just moan. There was a grassroots network, the NHS Workers Say No, who helped organise successfully, as it happened, to overturn that recommendation and put the strikes back on us. So now Pat Callan has then come back and tried to outmaneuver them with and shut down the strike. So there's challenges here. But that was an important moment. There's a campaign in the CWU. It's actually a much weaker campaign, but there's huge amounts of opposition to the deal. One of the tragedies is most of the people who normally carry arguments inside the CWU from the top to the rest feel that pressure of not criticising the leadership, of staying loyal. And some of it's pessimism, some of them are swallowing their own doubts. And one of the things we have to learn is that we have to take these arguments and say there are problems, we have to address it. We have to take that into our workplaces and our union structures and not feel that pressure. You're often the person, aren't you, rallying people, fighting for it. You have to still raise these questions. And I think there's more people who want to discuss these things. And it's connected, it's connected to the question of increasing the level of participation and control over our disputes. So it's not just channeled from the top. That means rebuilding traditions of mass picketing, not just to talk to people who might go in, but because it involves collective empowerment rather than sitting at home passively. It involves, after a picket line, I want to see a mass meeting, or on the picket line, or in the cafe, where there's discussion, not just an official talking to people, but discussion, votes about the strategy. Much greater rebuilding of strike committees, an old tradition, not just to deliver the strike, but start to debate questions of strategy and where we're going forward. In other words, the lesson here is don't just criticise, don't just moan, we have to organise. And the final point I want to say is the fact that we now have more strikes does not mean that we now drop the question of raising politics. There's an old tradition. I'm sick of union leaders going on the TV or the radio, and they get attacked by this is really a politically motivated strike. We don't want to talk about the wages and the issue. And you can't just respond by saying, oh, no, it's just about wages. These are profoundly political questions about power and wealth and services and what they're for in society. It's not a diversion to raise these questions. It strengthens our union organisations. I mean, the St Mungo strikers, it's very interesting, they've had a whole series of daily mass rallies, and they've themed some of those rallies. So one was about pride and LGBT liberation, one was about refugees and anti-racism. This strengthens disputes. The fact that in the PCS, the union, which is very proud of, has taken up the question of opposition to the Rwanda plan right into the Home Office and their members in the Home Office, and won some of those arguments. Right? This is incredible because the fact that comrades in the UCU have raised one of the hardest questions about opposition to the Ukraine war. It's a hard argument. It's not a diversion. Raising these bigger questions strengthens our movement. And therefore, to end, look, we have to be the people who are the most enthusiastic, the most committed, the most hardworking about building the strikes and organising in our workplaces and unions. But we cannot just be cheerleaders. We have to be the people who are also the most serious about addressing the problems and raising the question of challenging a strategy that is too limited and having a bolder vision about what real victories are and trying to win people, whether you have a majority on the room or not. You have to put these arguments and try to persuade people. And experience is beginning to expand the number of people who think there is a problem here a year on. That's who we have to consolidate. That's what this event, the Workers' Summit, we'll say more about this in this meeting, is about. It's about trying to generalise and draw together those elements of people, various union to union, struggle to struggle, who have some understanding in order to strengthen that current inside our movement. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mike. Our next speaker is Jess Walsh. She is a organiser for workplaces and trade unions in the Socialist Workers' Party and an elected member of the Socialist Workers' Party leadership. Over to you, Jess.
Thanks so much. Okay, yeah, thanks so much, Mark. I think you get a sense from what Mark has said that, a year into the strike movement, there's definitely lots to be celebrated, a revival of resistance, a revival of confidence, but you get a sense from the kind of balance sheet that Mark talked us through that there are now questions about how to proceed. There are, how do we win those decisive victories? How do we organise to, for a completely, for a different strategy than the one that's being pursued by the trade union leaders, and importantly, how do we resist any attempts to call off our strikes, try and call off strikes just for talks, or recommend deals that are below inflation and much below the kind of aspirations of the people who went on strike in the first place. And I think the reason, part of the reason we've written the book and the bits that I've contributed to is to kind of equip a new generation of workers and socialists in the unions with some, theoretical conclusions and lessons from the past, lessons from the past eras and past struggles. Because the thing is like eruptions and strikes, like the one we've seen, eruptions of confidence by the working class, the eruptions of struggle, they can be decades apart. As we've talked about, there is little living memory of high points of struggle in this generation of strikers. Lessons can be lost, and because these waves are very far apart, that it means I think the stakes are very high. We have to take our opportunities when there is this return of resistance, workplace resistance, to push home and try and win some big victories, because the victories won by the working class at high points of struggle are extremely meaningful and have in fact constituted the most meaningful gains that our side has made. They haven't been won in Parliament as those in the Labour Party would have us believe. But that also means that I think that very few in the trade union movement today have experienced, the enormous victories, for instance, that striking workers struck against, government in the 70s, for instance. We're actually emerging from a period of defeats from the movement, from the period of miners' strike in the mid-80s until now, and a historically low level of struggle has persisted from then until now, very low level of strikes. And I think this has resulted in a bit of pessimism, that's still in sections of the trade union movement that doesn't always live up to the excitement that we've seen in the picket lines and stuff of the last year, the anger that people feel at the crisis in society. And I think that's especially concentrated at the level of the trade union leaders and the trade union bureaucracy. And this is combined with, I think, an inexperience in some unions from activists about how to overcome the obstacles that trade union leaders can place in our way in attempts to call off strikes and settle for less than we need. I think there's green shoots where that's starting to change, where groups of workers learning from experience from recent years. I'm just going to talk about two important examples. I think activists in the university college union, which represents academic staff from universities, have quite a lot of accumulated experience now in having to question the leadership in the union, not just the current general secretary, but previous ones, and campaign to reverse decisions to call off strikes, accept poor deals, etc. There has been, lots of repeated strikes in universities in the recent past, meaning that activists in the UCU have some of the highest level of experience of strikes in the unions, and as such, I think have learned lessons about how to operate independently. And I think Mark mentioned it, I think the NHS Workers Say No campaign, which emerged from health worker activists actually horrified at the inaction of trade union leaders during the pandemic to kind of come out and fight for health workers on the questions of safety, PPE, etc., and then went on to take up questions of pay. They're going through a process, learning, I think that, these are groups of workers going through a process of learning in recent years. Learning, I think, that unions as institutions cannot always be trusted to take a lead when we need them to. Workers on the ground have to take a lead in campaign and build independent networks around these questions. And I think the key role that NHS Workers Say No had in overturning the rotten health pay deal offered by the Tories and recommended by the nurses union, I think we have a lot to learn from there. So I think they're important examples because I think workers and activists, especially new layers of them, it can be very disorientating if you're a union leader suddenly putting obstacles and calling off strikes, and it can be very demoralizing, I think, for new activists. These people are supposed to be on our side after all, on the side of workers and not the bosses. And I think our role as socialists has to be to provide clarity, a coherent explanation as to why this happens, right? And also combined with a way forward, a method for overcoming this. And I think there's some modest attempt to help to do this in the book, basically. Okay, so I think around the left there are many explanations as to why trade union leaders so often act in this way, or the trade union bureaucracy, why this so often happens. And I think these explanations vary from, political persuasion, they're right-wing, or they're, personal failings, they're corrupt. But I think these explanations fail to explain why this problem is so widespread. Why is it, for instance, that Pat Cullen, who's a right-wing leader of the nurses union, the Royal College of Nurses, and Joe Grady, a trade union leader who actually emerged from a revolt against a previous general secretary in the UCU, the University Union, why have they acted in like virtually indistinguishable ways when it's come to attempts to like shut down their disputes in exchange, for political gain, or going into calling off strikes just for talks, a very conservative outlook. What is it that makes them? And I think this is not a new problem in the British trade union movement, and we look to this in the book. And the solution, as I said, usually offered, we need to get rid of the leaders and elect new ones, or we need to, elect someone who accepts a lower wage so they can more directly understand what workers experience. But I think this doesn't explain historically even why the best leaders act this way as well. So in the SWP, we looked at the theory of the trade union bureaucracy to explain why this happens. This is developed by the founder of the Socialist Workers' Party, Tony Cliff, and I think it's very, very relevant for us today. Explain why trade union officials play this conservative role. And when I say the trade union bureaucracy, I'm talking about full-time officials of the union who derive their living from the union job. They have a different social position to workers on the one hand, ordinary rank and file union members, and bosses on the others. So what is their position that can explain this? So for Marxists, as we know, the central division in society is between bosses and workers. The exploitation of workers shapes our society, shapes capitalist society. And trade unions have emerged as organizations that are formed by the collective action of workers to resist this exploitation, right? And they're usually formed out of struggle. However, they're very contradictory forms, and they often reflect that contradiction, right? Especially at times of heightened struggle, you can see this. They're fundamentally shaped by the frameworks and limits of the system itself. They exist both to resist exploitation, but they also rely for their continued existence on the continuation of capitalist system of wage labour. So they, that while they resist exploitation, they do not attempt to end it, but aim to improve it through negotiation for higher wages. So they end up giving expression to workers' resentment, right? But also aim to fundamentally contain it and channel it through official means. So officials are neither workers, they don't, as you know, full-time officials don't directly experience the same level of exploitation. They often paid quite a bit more than workers on the shop floor. They don't experience the drudgery of work, the horrible conditions, etc. So they're usually quite separated from the experience of workers on the shop floor. I think, especially in Britain, the trade union movement is very, very established, and some of the trade unions in Britain have their roots from, 100 years ago. They're very large and established organisations. They have property, assets, and a large workforce. So trade union leaders can often see their role as protecting the longevity of health of that organisation instead of, taking on big fights for their members, seeing themselves as like class fighters, right? And I think, the anti-union laws, when they're brought in, they quite cleverly target union funds as a punishment for breaking the law, which is why you often have full-time officials and union leaders saying, no, we cannot go past the what's allowed in the law, even when it's necessary to press home to win, when it's necessary, when they're arguing against occupation, for instance, secondary picketing, solidarity action, all these, traditions from the past that help us to win, they argue against that because their funds would be threatened. And I think trade union leaders often cannot and will not go into any kind of major confrontation with the government. They don't see that as their role. They're completely wedded to it. And I think, we see the role of the Labour Party here as a kind of separation of like the political struggle, which is taken on by the Labour Party, and the narrow economic struggle just for bread and butter issues that's taken on by the union leaders. So I think if we look at this, if we look at the trade union leaders' position, right, their explicit position, I think the solution has to be not to elect new leaders, but to build at the base a counter pressure to this to this conservatism, because even the most right-wing union leaders can, when there's enough confidence and pressure from the base, be forced to call action. So that's kind of what we should look to. And I think in the third chapter, I think we look to some lessons from the past where where the British working class has, overcome some of this conservatism. Because I think, while in Britain we have some of the most established and conservative layer of trade union officials, because of what I've said, this long tradition of trade union movement and long tradition of social democracy. But there's also, because of that, a very important tradition of building rank and file networks within the British working class, and that's kind of what we're looking at in chapter 3. And there's some really key innovations that we look to in the past as to kind of inspire what we do in the future. So in chapter 3, there's a brief history that we look to, since the 1910s. Wave of struggle from 1910 to 1921, and we looked at that through to the present day. It's a brief history. It's a short, as you see, it's a short book. Good for taking into workplaces, selling at union branches. We want it to be accessible for people to take on picket lines. We want this to be a tool and a thing for people to use. So if we look to, I think the key innovation that kind of we want to look to came in 1915. With the first kind of conscious rank and file network that was set up called the Clyde Workers' Committee, and that was consciously because of the experience of the struggles of 1910 to 1914, consciously set up to be able to act independently of union leaders when they were trying to pull us back. And I think this kind of this approach there's a phrase that's often used, that was used by the Clyde Workers' Committee that kind of shows our approach, what our approach should be in trying to fight for a different strategy. And that kind of approach that we look to in the Socialist Workers' Party of how we approach the question of officials and building and organising in the union, and that is working with the bureaucracy when they're representing things and pushing things forward, but being willing to act independently of them should they not. So this is from the Clyde Workers' Committee. It says we will support the officials just so long as they rightly represent the workers. But we will act independently, immediately then misrepresent them, and we can act immediately according to the wishes and desires of the rank and file. So I think, this tradition, this body was able to pull strikes of tens of thousands of workers absolutely independently, and sometimes in the direct hostility of trade union leaders. So I think, looking to this. And then, other high points that we look at is during the 70s when there was a strong rank and file tradition, which was the backbone of some big national confrontations with the government that they were able to win. So we look to the lessons of the past because I think they have lessons for today. And I'm not suggesting that we need to immediately set up a rank and file movement tomorrow. I don't think we're near that level of confidence. But we look to. But that kind of has to be our goal, right? Looking to building up the confidence of rank and file workers at every opportunity, to take control of our disputes, as Mark said, and that means fighting for strike committees, mass participation in the disputes. And we want to generalise the lessons of how some workers have been able to reject the bad deals that have been offered to them by the Tories, and how we reverse decisions to pull off strikes, and with the goal of thinking how, hopefully one day we'll be able to set up something that can act completely independently if need be. And I think that's why the Workers' Summit is so important, and why every socialist should be coming to it and fighting tooth and nail to get people there from their workplaces, union branches. Because we need to have a discussion across the unions, build the coordination at the base of them that's been kind of abandoned at the top. That's been missing, and fight for a much more hard-hitting strategy. And we want to fight for that across the unions, right? We want to be fighting for a strategy that can cause a big enough crisis for the government that they're forced to hand us the gains we so desperately need. And I think to do that, we can look to the lessons, the traditions that have been provided by the British working class when we were winning, and that was when we had a confident rank and file at the base of the unions that was able to overcome the conservatism of union officials. And I think, that there are battles to come. There's still many disputes to be decided, and there will be more battles, more strikes in the coming future, because we're in a system in crisis, right? That's been the theme of Marxism, hasn't it? The system in crisis, but that means there will be more struggles, and that outcome, I think, of them will ultimately be decided by the confidence of our side to take on those struggles, to take on, the confidence of rank and file workers, ordinary people, to take on those struggles, to lead. And that therefore has to be, the centre of our activity, I think, in the unions. Thanks.
Okay, we've reached that bit of the meeting. Thanks very much, Jess, where we can talk amongst ourselves for a couple of minutes, and then we're going to start taking speakers.
Thanks, Peter, and thanks, Mark and Jess. I want to talk about the Salongo's experience, because it really is a microcosm of what we heard from Jess and Mike, what's been happening on a national level. As you know from the opening rally, we're on indefinite strike action, but I want to go back to the start at the moment. Thank you very much. Mark talked about initial enthusiasm. We had this initial enthusiasm. Our people were a bit nervous about going on strike. Once the strike started, 300 odd people in a WhatsApp group, strike WhatsApp group. Pickets were fantastic. A competition, a picket of the day, who can, a healthy competition of picketing, theme rallies, Mark said anti-racism, injecting politics in there, LGBT themes, Pride rally as well, with guest speakers, we had Corbyn there, John McDonald, and good numbers on strike, importantly. Mark mentioned about episodic. We learned from other disputes, national disputes, where the 2 days, 3 days wasn't working, so we were never going to go for that. The reps suggested 3 weeks initially, but the members pushed them and said we need more than 3 weeks, and chose to go out for 4 weeks. But what do you do then when the employer digs their heels in? Our CEO used to work for the Home Office. She's learned what the government are doing on a national scale. Dig your heels in, the union will come back crawling. What do you do then? This is where the cracks start to emerge a little bit. So the convener says, well, let's just go out for 2 more weeks and then go back in work. Hang on a minute, what's that going to do if we go back and work and clean up the mess that they've left for us? We pushed an argument of indefinite action and had to win that argument, but then the concerns come. Is there enough democracy in this dispute? The convener loses that argument but still tries to push to the members that we should go out for 2 weeks and there, and doesn't respect the vote that was taken. So we set up strike committees on a local level. Importantly, it's not happening across all the dispute, but just on a local level to organising. A lot of people surpassed expectations of the employer, have stayed solid on picket lines and are not going back into work. Just this week, the day of the opening rally, we had a poor offer of 3%. I'm disgusted that the union convener even dared to even have a conversation. We've been fighting for 10%. He put an offer of 3% to the members. There's now an e-ballot. But thankfully on Friday, the members showed their absolute revulsion. 2 minutes, thank you very much. The members showed their absolute revulsion at the 3% offer. We've been fighting for 10%, not for 3%. He had no mandate to do that. It shows you the issues of democracy in this dispute. So this question of participation, ensuring people stay and don't allow the pessimism of the convener, who actually, just brilliant analysis of the trade union bureaucracy, a convener who's an employee of St Mungo's acting like he's on 200 grand as General Secretary and trying to sell out the deal was absolutely laughable. So for this dispute to win the victory it can win, we have to push for democracy. We have to push for, as Mark and Jess have been talking about, strike committees over the whole dispute, meeting face to face. Because what happens in Zoom meetings, people who are not even on strike are in there having their opinions and things like that. We want to be meeting face to face, pushing forward. We aren't going back in work until we win this. I hope this week the offer will be rejected. We can join up with the teachers and social solidarity, the national market on Wednesday, and keep pushing for the 10%. I'll stop there.
I want to talk really a bit about being political in your trade union and being political at work. And I think there's both times when you it's a formal setting, but also times when you just have to be consistently and relentlessly political, really. And I suppose the formal settings, I think of, we've seen all these strikes taking place over the last year. And I'm in Unison, I'm on the NEC in Unison. And therefore, in our branch anyway, we have a big push on going to local disputes and showing solidarity. But I always feel that, you're only on those bodies if you only put up with the, cane of those bodies to use them for better gain, really. So I always try to use them to, you know, speak and give solidarity to the picket lines. And I always make a point of talking about how the Tories try and divide us, yes, by the different sectors in dispute, but actually by racism. We're talking about Rwanda and saying the problem isn't the small boats, it's the luxury yachts, and trying to picture it in a way that makes sense to people. And I won't lie, sometimes it goes down better than others. And you sometimes have to really force yourself to make sure that you include that point as well. But actually, there's always somebody who comes up to you afterwards and thanks you for saying it. Nearly always a black worker, but not always a black worker. And sometimes, of course, it goes down really well because it ties in with some of the questions that people are starting to come up with as well. So, I mean, that, you know, talked about some months ago when we talked about it there, it's probably the best applauded bit of anything that I said. You know, there's other when on a PCS picket line in the British Library, people were coming up and thanking me for mentioning what their union had been doing over Rwanda. And so I think that's really important. Anytime you go to a picket line to raise those kind of questions. I think the other thing is the impact of being political in your own workplace. And I'm the branch secretary of my local branch, decided that when I did that, one of the things I had to really do was think about how I could always be raising politics. And we have done it relentlessly. We've done it by getting guest speakers. We've done it by having different topics that we spoke about. We used, when we had lockdown pandemic, we started having weekly online meetings, and we've never stopped having them. So we have a union meeting every single week in our branch, which is something that I think would be hard to start up now, but it's easy to keep going. And we have loads of political discussions in them. But we're having a balance, it's just coming to an end at the moment in local government. And so I tried to get in speakers to be political about that. And we had a range of speakers. We had Mick Lynch come to speak, a couple of hundred people came to hear him. We also had our own General Secretary coming to speak in there as well. And she was very good on why he needs to vote and all the rest of it. And then loads of people asked questions, and a big bit of the questions came up was about what do we do if we are on strike? Are we going to have a big demonstration? What kind of action are we going to see? And one person, none of these were thrown in, you know, I didn't set anybody up. Somebody said, we need to be French, don't we? Look at what they had in France over the tensions. We need to be much more French. Her response was the French demonstrations. It's not people on strike, you know, it's just people who are demonstrating for the hell of it. Really, it's about trying to put down our expectations of what we might get if we get over the threshold. This week, as people unfortunately couldn't turn up, it was particularly Chris Moore's, and his flight was delayed and all that kind of stuff. And we cancelled the meeting, but 100 people still turned up, so we thought we'd better talk about something. And actually, it was another member that said, have you read anything about spy cops? So we had a huge discussion about police. Somebody else said, have you seen the news about Rwanda? So we had a discussion about that. I've been talking about Carla Foster, so we had another discussion about abortion rights, trying to bring all those things in, because the reality is the people who've got involved whilst we've had those discussions, who are our newer reps, have been the ones who've led in organising overpay. They've been the ones who've done the detailed work on getting the vote out. Some of their sections have got 80-85% turnout from the returns that they've had off members. I don't think that means we'll automatically get over the threshold, but I think it shows the potential. And therefore, our argument next week has to be that we have to continue being French.
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm introduced you. I'll say something about the moment. I think first thing to say really is Mark talks about there being sort of a balance sheet, which he's talked about, and absolutely agree with everything being been said. I mean, if you like to shorten it, round one we've just had, we're back, changes are popular, but we haven't broken through yet. That's the problem we have. That's what we have to try and do. Round two is obviously coming up. And I mean, further education, we have just had a consultative ballot. We had 87% vote for strike action and 51% turnout. We will be taking action. All we could be an education strike right across higher education, further education, schools. I hear that head teachers are looking like they possibly could go coming out. That is the iron prize, if you like, coming into the new year. So we have to move on. But the problem is we can't simply repeat what we did last time. We have to do something different. And this is why the Workers' Summit is so important, it seems to me, because we need to get those groups of workers who are learning the lessons of each other and working out how best to take the struggle forward, and it cannot be led to the leaders at the top of the union for the reasons that Jess and others have actually spelled out. And I think the question about escalation is so important precisely because, and coordination, because sometimes you can win simply by having a ballot. I've done it. I've had a ballot, I went boom, and I went, oh, all right, what do you want? Other times that can take a couple of days. And I went boom, and they go, all right, what do you want? But it doesn't always happen like that. And at the moment, because The crisis is so deep, the cost of living crisis is so deep, their side cannot give in. They know that. They know as soon as they give in to something, the floodgates will open. And that's why it takes a lot more than boom to get what you need out of it. You have to take a strategy and a tactic that meets that crisis, that scale, and so on. That's why if you had 5 days of the teachers coming out in 5 days, you've had to, I'm sure Paul everyone will agree, you've had the tourists on their knees coming back from straight away. 2 days, 2 days, 2 days, over 6 months, they can ride out. They don't like it, it hurts them, but they can ride it out. My last point is this, lessons to be learned. You see, absolutely, there's an argument side of trade union like Jamie Cleaveites and so on and so forth, that you have to build long-term and long way and so on. Unfortunately, the Kevin Courtneys, the Marx Advocates, great left-wing trade unions as they are, have learned the wrong lessons from 2011. What they learned was not we didn't do too much strike action. What they learned was we didn't have high enough density. You build density, one, by going on strike. 60,000 people have joined the union. Secondly, you don't have to learn the lessons. Of course, you can't skip workers' experiences, but you don't have to do 4 years of doing what UCU have done to come up with the solidarity movement. You can do it much quicker than that. Look at the RCN. The RCN, 106 years they haven't been on strike for. But how many days? 5, 10 days? I finished that. 5, 10, 15 days, I don't know how many days they've got on strike. They've learned lessons what took 4 years of UCU to learn. You can move very, very quickly indeed, and the least organised can jump ahead of the most organised. That's the key lesson you have to learn as well.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, the NEU will be out on strike on Wednesday and Friday, so naturally. Wednesday will be much more parlous, so if you're not doing it, or you get out on Wednesday, come and join us, and I'm really proud of how lots of support people there, not just because of the solidarity with support those, because they can bring that example of how to fight the strike committees, all that action, to our members and our activists, that will strengthen our ability to put those arguments in our union. So it's for real practical reasons, I want to support those strikers there on Wednesday. The point I want to make really though is that how important is that analysis that Mark and Jess talked about understanding why the union leaders, even the best of them, behave the way they do. It's not because they're bad people or overpaid, some of them are bad people and some of them are overpaid, but that's not the reason why they all behave like that. It's that understanding of the social role, their instinct to mediate, to conciliate, to settle, not to go for the jugular and fight to mobilise from below to really smash through when it comes from their social role, and understanding that means you understand how to relate to even the best union leaders, the most left-wing ones. In my union, we've got that. Our union leader, Kevin Courtney, is one of the best union leaders in Britain. He's done fantastic activities and stand up to this, being a stalwart of that. He has called and led action under COVID when we stopped the schools, pulled back, and that stayed large. He's led strikes this year. Our new union leader, who's about to take office, Daniel Kevin, is even better. He's a really class fighter, but I tell you, they're behaving exactly the same way as the union leaders in the way that Jess and Mark said. You have to understand that. I want to illustrate it concretely because we had some fantastic strikes earlier on this year, and then we got to Easter when we had all those strikes and we came to our conference. What should have happened then is pile on the pressure, escalate the action to really mobilise and drive through and make the government the way that's shown. If we'd shut the schools down for 1 week, 2 weeks, we'd have probably won something there. They couldn't bear that level of crisis. That's not what our union leaders did though. Their residents, let's hesitate, let's be cautious. Exams are coming up, we better not upset the Daily Mail and the media, so let's not have a pause for 2 months. We argued against it, we said keep striking. Their argument was quite simple. Have we done a good job leading so far? Trust us. That was the only argument they had, and lots of members did trust them because they had done a good job. So we got on 20%, not enough. But they were worried that that pressure was important because they came back, they had no further action proposed, and I know this was out in the room, and they came and said, oh, we'll propose 3 days of action after the exams. Good, at least it's better than no action at all. But again, their instincts come in. They didn't go out of conference and talk about the strikes, they didn't mobilise people, they kept quiet about it, that led to doubt worries. And then this is what left union leaders do. They didn't go to the more advanced areas, the people that want to fight and organise there and say, how do we pull the weaker areas into action? Deliberately, they travelled, no offence to people in Hampshire or Cornwall or Dorset or anywhere like that, they identified the weaker areas where members were wobbling, they went there, Kevin Courtney went there, Daniel Kennedy went there, didn't argue with those people, listened to them, and then came back and reflected all those doubts and those worries in the arguments in the National Union to scale down the 3 days, down to the 2 days that we got. So that's the way these people operate. They look to the most backward sections to reflect their arguments and use that to hesitate and conciliate, not to the most advanced sections, and then use that as a base to really fight and pull the weaker sections with you. And that's the difference between our strategy and a left union strategy. We say stand on the most militant people, the best organised people. That's not always a majority, but if you base yourself there, organise there, then you argue and try and pull the others into action. The left union needs to do it the other way around, and that's a fundamental difference. And that's why the Workers' Summit that we've got in September is so important, because we have the biggest side that understands that organises at the rank and file and has a greater weight so that we win that tussle that's going to go on, and it will go on in the autumn as well. It's not finished with what happens this side of the summer holidays.
Hi, yeah, I'm in Dorset Socialist Workers' Party, and I think the most common thing that somebody has said on any of the picket lines I've been on the last year is, I wish we were like the French. And actually, if you look at what's going on there, I mean, obviously we're not at the level where 3.5 million people have been on strike and then a few months later there are uprisings all over the country. But if you look at what we have seen in Britain over the last year, even in sleepy Dorset, the huge numbers of new workers on strike for the very first time, many of them women, coming out at the beginning of their strikes, you know, like festivals, carnivals, mass pickets on outside hospitals where they don't even have a rep, you know, fantastic change. And I think we really have to understand that that's changed things, even though we haven't yet had a breakthrough and we haven't had any victories, nor have we had any defeats, actually. And I think what Jess was saying about, and other people, about the lessons that people have learned from the past that you don't realise they've learned. You know, how did the RCN get their vote no, organisation? It did come from the past during COVID. You can see it with the junior doctors as well as UCU. You know, they've been on strike before, and so their strikes are a bit different. And so I think in terms of whether we can build a rank and file organisation now, I think we have to really obviously try and win the disputes that are going on, but we shouldn't forget the ones that have settled. 2 minutes. I think, you know, for us in Dorset, I think we've got to go and see, we've got 150 people on a strike, solidarity, WhatsApp group, families, whatever. We've got to go to those 150 people, and it won't just be sending a WhatsApp message. We've got to go and have proper conversations with all of those people we've met, including the brilliant nurses and ambulance drivers who are no longer out on strike, and try and get them to the Workers' Summit. But we've got another task. I mean, the French workers have as well. Will they stand with the rioters and the rebellion going on? In Dorset, we've got a refugee barge about to arrive any minute. We've also got to go to those 150 people and get them on our demonstration next Saturday to say no to the far right. And actually, that will be as important about keeping in touch with those people and building a relationship with those people, because we don't know what's going to happen in the future, but you can feel there could be a nurses' strike next summer as well, you know, that people will have learned the lessons the next time round, so.
Yeah, thank you. Right, I'm a member of Edinburgh Socialist Workers' Party. I'm also the co-secretary of my PCS branch, which represents members working in job centres in and around Edinburgh. And I'm going to cut a lot of what I was going to say. But we've had quite a bit of strike action, but it's nowhere near enough. When the strikes have happened, the PCS members, as Mark said, they've had high levels of involvement by members. They've had big rallies. In Edinburgh, we had a rally of 1,000 people. Lots of younger workers getting involved, the picket lines being much more diverse than they've been in the past. But that level of action has achieved some concessions from the government. The problem is the concessions are nowhere near enough. And on pay, they've announced pay will increase by 4.5 to 5% this year when it would have been 2%. They've also allowed departments to pay £1,500 to work in recognition of the cost of living pressures from last year. Now that actually is not worth £1,500 to anyone. There's lots of arguments as to why that's the case, but it's just not good enough. And members of my union branch had an evening where really well attended attended meeting alongside the neighbouring branch, 150 members attending. And it was nearly unanimous to say that these concessions are not enough and we want to continue the dispute. And we have to tell the NEC that, because the problem is our NEC is going round branches giving clear messages that they are indicating that they will end this dispute unless members are prepared to significantly escalate the action that they're taking. But what they are not emphasising is how well we've actually done so far and how well the strike action has been supported when it has been taken. So I'll sum up by saying we have now set up the PCS Workers Say No campaign, and we're trying to learn from NHS workers say no, and we are involved in as many other PCS branches as possible to put pressure on the NEC, and we're encouraging people to go to the Workers' Summit as well. Thanks.
Thanks, UCU, NEC. So just wanted to pick up on some of the comments that you made back on those already. And one of those that we recognised that I heard in the pool in FE was that we started with an approach local disputes, went to some regional disputes with other colleges, most of them successful, and then the member looking for national action, national disputes. We're looking at what's happening in the HE sector, trying to the kind of foibles that are going on there within our union. But the thing that I really want to comment on is that in the machinery of the union, there are definitely neutralising forces. So people who get into leadership positions because, again, they get voted on by the machinery of the union, to be reformists, to dampen down the spirit. And unfortunately, the rank and file that join the union, they're attracted by the disputes and they're attracted by the causes that are close to their heart, are then in this what one would commonly say from unison, and it's like disequilibrium taking place because of the leadership. So one of the things I wanted to propose in our union is that we can start to predict that this is going to happen and try to have those messages pretty much ready at hand for when those neutralising things are affecting there. But in our union, there's another thing that happens. They absolutely knew that there was victimisation in our college, because there was already 4 Fs before mine, I've been a victimised trade union. They knew that was happening. They didn't act, even though we had the rank and file wanted to do a local strike action. So there's something going on other than this neutralising when there's industrial action. There's a neutralising going on when there's reps who are standing up to dealing for your union and NEC too.
Brilliant, thanks. I'll try not to speak too fast. Richard Wild, I'm GCU branch co-chair at University of Greenwich. Apologies to other unions if I'll focus a little bit on what's going on in the university, but applies, I'm sure, to all other sectors. It feels as though I've been chairing Greenwich since we were on the picket line before the pandemic, and so I still feel relatively new and just feel frustrated that not only are we fighting our employers, but we're fighting our government, we're increasingly, it feels, fighting our union membership, and occasionally fighting our own membership. And it shouldn't be that way, given the situation across the sector. So we're fighting on pay against inequality, against casualisation, and against burnout workloads, but actually we're fighting for a lot more than that. More than 50% of higher education staff are thinking of leaving the sector, 77% plus are suffering from poor health, well-being as a result of stress. We hear about the, oh my gosh, the great resignation, the big quitting, the quiet quitting, etc. We've had the ABC of austerity, Brexit, COVID, followed by DEF, destruction, environment, fraud, greed, cost of greed crisis, etc. It shouldn't be hard to win this now, so why can't we? A lot of the reasons have been mentioned. One is our leadership. CEOs and general secretaries look increasingly similar. Yeah? St Mungo's is on 187,000, ours is on 180,000. They're not workers on the floor suffering from the same things as we are, they're not losing pay. We need to reclaim our unions. It's not enough The French, at least they send all of their leaders to one school, so it's really easy to recognise who they are. They all go to the École Nationale d'Administration, set up by de Gaulle. Is that it? Okay, all right. Oh, one last thing, someone, please. Yeah. So reclaim our unions is one thing we should do. Ignore all of this Machiavelli rubbish about organising membership and 100% membership, and actually indefinite strike action, coordinated strikes, aggregate ballots. The best way to build is to take action and to win action. And lastly, collective, and this is, I'm a lawyer slash criminologist, so we really need to use militant legal action, targeted militant legal action, like the IWGB do. I mean, it's just such a tool we don't use. Thank you.
Thank you, comrades. Just wanted to say something about, I'm not going to repeat Steve West's point about PCS says no, but this has come out of our experience of grassroots organising in PCS, because our leadership has been exactly what people have described, Candy and Paul McGrath described in this meeting. And it's very surprising if you've never been through it before, and I haven't in this way. And we've only had 3 national one-day strikes in our union over the last 6 months. And in the middle of March, we were told not to do local rallies for our strike. We were told to come to London, except loads of people didn't want to come to London from Manchester. And essentially, activists in NEU, BNA and PCS pushed to have a rally. So we had to organise a rally. It was only us. And we asked for some money to do it and stuff, and it was a surprise. And thinking about it now, after this meeting, it's like, this is where we started doing stuff that's completely kind of out of our experience. I mean, that says a lot about how inexperienced some people are in PCS. And we have lost lots of momentum with this one-day strike a month national stuff. It's really been difficult, and with the anti-trade union laws and the loss of momentum, lots of our branches have not got over the threshold in the second national ballot, including mine. And I have a 40% militant membership. But, you don't need many accidents of people moving house or, crises coming out of their experience of COVID and stuff to lose a ballot by 25 votes in our case. Okay, so I think what I'm saying here is that the Workers' Summit is a fantastic opportunity for us, as we've all said here, but also it's like, the fact that even in branches where we haven't got over the threshold, we have this militant minority, and that's an enormous step forward for us, and it's incredibly refreshing, and this meeting has been extremely useful. Thank you, comrades.
So our next speaker does it support the week, Jess, Walsh, and then we'll bring Matt on back in. Thanks very much.
All right, thanks very much, comrades. It's been a massively useful discussion. There's not many forums that are created like this, are there, where workers from different unions can come together and discuss strategy, not even within the unions, there's, so I think it's important that we fight for spaces like this in the disputes where we are, the strike committees and everything else. I think there's a wealth of experience that has been expressed in this room. People have been through an experience in the last year, how much has been learned, and we need to generalise that. And I think that means we really need to challenge ourselves and raise our sights when it comes to the Workers' Summit, because I believe it could be an epic event, but that means that we all have to fight for it in our unions. So I think, that big vision that we're talking about, we have over 30 union branches now backing it. Could we make that 100 by the time it gets to it? Can you use the leaflet that we've given you? Go to the Eventbrite, there's a link to the model motion. Pass the model motion in your union branch, or at least raise it. If you lose it, if you can't win support for it, you might find a couple of people who agree with you and who you can bring to the event. And that's all about trying to win a side, isn't it? Around the kind of questions that we're talking about. You might not always you might not always be in the majority around some of these questions when it comes to strategy, the more hard-hitting strikes and escalation and everything else. But fighting for a minority so that you can win more in the future is an important way, I think. Because what we want really is a stronger current in the broader working class that have learned, from comrades in the ECU about how they've been resisting attempts from their General Secretary to, calling off action. We want to learn from the St Mungo strikers about how they're able to keep up the momentum in an all-out strike and how they've been going for an indefinite strike. And we want to argue for more all-out indefinite strikes across the unions. And we have to look for spaces for the rank and file workers to debate this strategy. We don't just want to leave it to those at the top, and we want to give confidence for people to go back and organise in their unions. So, Workers' Summit. We want to, if everyone could do me a favour actually, if you got your leaflet right now, scan it on your phone and booked your ticket right now, that would be extremely helpful. So we can get a good bunch of booking-ins from here and then fight for everyone around you to do that as well. Because I agree with what Sean said, if we're talking about round two, right, how are we going to make sure that we win round two? It's about having more experience in bigger sections of the working class of fighting for a bigger strategy, and that's what this is about. We need lead struggles that to come to a decisive victory, right? And that means, strikes on a much bigger scale, more control for a base from the base that express the fury that people feel at the crisis. Because you often hear from union leaders, don't you? Oh, we don't really want to be on strike. We'd much rather be at work. But I think people are angry and they want to fight, and that's what isn't being expressed. They want to be part of militant struggles that can challenge the Tories, that can really put them on the back foot. We need to make them afraid of us, right? That's the scale of the action that will be required. So I think fighting for the Workers' Summit to try and have a bigger experience of how to fight for a more militant strategy is a key part of doing that. Okay, that's me, and I'll leave the rest to Mark.
Okay. Did I mention that we produced the book? Yes. So you can buy it outside. Why is there a chapter on France in the book? And one of the reasons is what Liz has mentioned. In every workplace, we're inspired by the struggles in France. But we also have to understand something else. Even with that higher level of intensity of strikes, there's been a problem. The trade union bureaucracy has still maintained a grip, and crucially, not making the shift to an indefinite general strike means that Macron will probably drive through his pension attacks. In other words, you can't simply celebrate strikes and think that will solve the problem of the trade union. It's a hard lesson, but we need to learn it. One of the arguments you get is precisely that it's bad individuals. The problem is the individual character of the union leader. If you look at the CWU, the leadership of the CWU, Dave Ward and a whole layer of people around them were precisely the militants who led the ways, for those with long memories, of early morning picket lines, the ways of unofficial strikes that spread through the post in the 90s and the early 2000s. They then became the leadership, and I think what's happened, Candy said, we haven't had big victories, nor have we had any major, that's true, we can't just generalise everything. I'll tell you, my feeling about the agreement that's been put in the CW, if it goes through, and it's clearly going to move for a revolt, but if it goes through, I think that does border much more. It's a devastating attack. Right? And that's because I think the union, as Sean put it, was used to saying, boo, look at our magnificent ballot results. And they were incredible. But faced with an employer that actually wanted a serious confrontation and debacle, the unions didn't know what to do. Right? So these are warnings, I think. I suppose the last thing I just want to say is, what are we trying to do? What's the project here? Through the course of these strikes and so on that we're trying to build, we are trying to build in the SWP a community of militants in the workplaces, rooted in, not just trade unionism, but wider socialist politics, theory, the things we've been talking, clarity about ideas, able to share collective experiences, because it is tough to struggle. In my workplace, people want indefinite, but you find out in other comrades, the mood isn't there. We're thinking about, using Section 44 to close the school. Is it just me? or am I behind the curve? Are the culprits getting up older? I have to have those experiences that you call. And you have to then develop, sometimes argue about, strategies and initiatives, depending on the balance of forces and possibilities and so on. And you can do all these things up to a point as an individual, but there are incredible pressures inside workplaces, inside unions, if you simply act as an individual. And moreover, even if you can resist those pressures, how do you break beyond delivering the goods in your own workplace, in the union branch? We need a bigger force if we're to contest the strategies that are going forward. So you have to create a network of militants. And here, we touch on this in the book. I think we need a break from even the kind of best traditions of much of the left, some of the best people, for instance, on the Labour left and so on, where, who support strikes, who go on picket lines, who raise arguments, who build solidarity and so on, but still respect in some ways that separation of politics and economics, which manifests itself is, I support the strikes, but you don't challenge the trade union leaderships. You respect the autonomy of the trade union leaderships. You don't build a challenge to it, let alone organise your supporters to try to develop that challenge and put it forward. We need a break from that approach. More is required of us at this moment if we're to fulfil the potential of rebuilding the working class. We don't want to see it slip back. And therefore, we have to construct a bigger socialist workers' party, which then influences a wider, not everyone's going to join and so on and so forth. We have to influence people, but we need a much bigger organisation to do that. And that's why I think if you're serious about trying to build on these experiences and take them forward, that has to be done inside that community of militants and making it bigger. And that's why we're asking you to join the SWP.